And the one place, Bangladesh, actually is having a pretty significant riot, but they always describe that as democracy wins, right? When
Yeah.
when the prime minister, I don't know if she first landed in India, but I heard that she's heading to Britain, will ended up
Mm.
in London or something. We don't
That
know,
doesn't
but anyway,
surprise me. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but the prime minister left. The Chinese media actually in January, when they first had election, when she won, there was already articles saying that the West are going to have a color revolution
Yeah.
because she's being regarded as a pro-China, helping China with the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. Is that your take on that?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. I mean, I should say that the thing to understand about Hashima, the um, leader of the now ousted leader of Bangladesh, is that she's the daughter of Bangladesh's independence leader, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and she represents a current in Bangladeshi politics that has always sought Bangladesh Bangladeshi independence, good relations with India, certainly, because India played a critical role in helping Bangladesh to become independent, but also has taken a negative view generally of the United States. I mean, because the US previously supported the government of Pakistan that her father rebelled against. And the United States, by the way, also backed the coup. There was a military coup that overthrew her father, Mujibur Rahman, and he was actually killed. So
Mm-hmm.
there is all this history. And she's been a long standing, and as far as I can see, popular leader, and in
Mm-hmm.
some ways a successful one. Bangladesh remains an extremely poor country,
Yeah.
but it has experienced a certain level of economic growth. It needs to develop its economy. It's got major need for heavy investment in the economy to change it from what it is at the moment, which is basically a country that makes a cheap um, clothing goods for Western consumers. A lot of your T-shirts are made in Bangladesh now, and that kind of thing. So there needs to be a major program for economic development and industrialization. The only country in the world that has the resources and the interest to help Bangladesh do that is China. And of course, that was the policy that she was trying to develop. And of course, that means that the Americans automatically are deeply suspicious of her. It also means that there are elements within Bengali society, Bangladeshi society, which will be suspicious of her too, because they are aligned with the United States. Many of the interests that want to keep Bangladesh into the world, basically to maintain it as the world's biggest sweatshop. They want to keep it like that. So that's why you have the coup, because that's what
Yeah.
this is. It's a coup.
And it looks familiar, isn't it? It's always
Yeah,
looks
yeah,
familiar, just
yeah,
like Venezuela, right?
yeah.
They're still working there. I mean, they're still
Oh,
trying
yeah.
to, yeah. Now, I also read that the US is ready to sanction India. Is that so? They have been back and forth with India. They're trying to pull the back to get India on their side, but India is too independent, I guess. The
Yes.
latest in the Chinese media are talking about is that there is a meeting. Blinken called in, I think, Australia, India, and Japan or somebody. There were four countries, and during that meeting, there's Blinken trying to divide India from China, saying, okay, you border problem, we should help you to resolve it or whatever. But the Indian foreign minister said, well, that's something between us and China. We can resolve it among ourselves. We don't need other
Yeah.
outsiders to get involved. And apparently Blinken was shocked by
Yeah.
that. So,
Yeah. Well, I know it's shock. The West has always develops these ideas that countries that don't get on with China hate China, and that this is somehow a long-standing historic thing, that India and China are always fated to be adversaries. They thought exactly the same about China and Russia. Till a couple of years ago, I mean, I wrote a piece for the Duran, by the way, because then we were just a website in 2015, in which I spoke about the fact that this relationship, this friendship between China and Russia that was developing then was real. It was not. It was not. It was not what some people were saying, an alliance of convenience, that China and Russia were frenemies. I said, that on the contrary, you actually look at what is really happening. This is real. This is actually a real development. And I said that again, a point we've made previously on our programs. People are not looking at the whole history of Chinese-Russian relations. They look at one period in the 1960s and early 1970s and assume that this is typical of the relationship as a whole. And it isn't. Now, if you go to the relationship between India and China, that is true.
Mhm.
Orders of magnitude more. I mean, China and India have had interactions for thousands of years, and generally they've been friendly. I mean, Chinese Buddhists have traveled to India.
Yeah. Mhm.
We discussed, the journey to the West in our previous program. That was all about a
Yeah.
Chinese person going to India.
India. Yeah.
There's been huge interactions between China and India, and there was even a period which people also forget in the 1950s when China and India were very good friends. In fact, again, at that time, many people thought that they were actually allies.
Mm.
And there was talk that Pandit Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, and Zhou Enlai were actual friends. And it looked for a
Mm.
time as if they were. And then what happened was, and this is where the problem has always been, that the Americans and to some extent the British have been able to play to some extent on Indian insecurity and
Mhm.
vanity and jealousy of the
Mm.
fact that China seems to be getting ahead. And that was what led to the crisis in the 1960s. And it's what's kept the tensions going between China and India ever since. But it's not something that is fated to be. In fact, it makes no sense. It makes no sense for India to be an adversary of China. And I think fundamentally, if you speak with Indian diplomats, I know three, by the way, including,
Mhm.
well, two ambassadors and one very senior diplomat, they will tell you this. They will say that, ultimately our priority has to be to repair our relations with China. We got
Mhm.
ourselves into this bad situation with China back in the 1960s when we made a whole series of mistakes. But Nehru made lots of mistakes. He destroyed what had up to then been a very good relationship. He thought that he could somehow extend Indian influence into Tibet, which is a crazy idea, and
Mhm.
started supporting the Dalai Lama of all people. I mean, don't get me started on the Dalai Lama. That India needs to find its way back from that, and they will do so, because India today is gradually regaining its confidence. It's now sensing that it is a rising country, and as a rising country, it understands that improving its relations with China, normalizing its relations with China, will give India that room for maneuver that will enable it to play its full role as, a rising great power. Whereas with the Americans, if it sticks with the Americans or gets too close with the Americans, the relationship with the Americans can never be an equal one,
Mhm.
because the Americans will never accept anybody as an equal. So that's the story. I mean,
Mhm. Isn't that? I would love to be hiding in that room, looking at Blinken's expression
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
India's foreign ministers tell him basically mind your own business. We can take care of this.
Well, I know. I mean, this is again. I've argued just as I used to argue with people about China and Russia. I, I've had so many arguments with people here in Britain about this thing that, oh no, you don't understand what you're talking about. There's no way India will ever reconcile, have a rapprochement with China. That is impossible. They hate the Chinese. They're afraid of the Chinese. They need us to protect them from the Chinese. Justin, you don't know what you're talking about. You really don't. I mean, and they don't. I mean, but because this situation of Chinese Indian antagonism suits them, they think it will last forever.
Yeah.
This is such a nihilistic approach to diplomacy. Keep China and India at odds with each other.
Mhm.
Play up all the time the antagonism of them. Tell the Indians, look, you can't really get close to the Chinese. You mustn't trust them. They're dangerous. All that sort of thing. This isn't the way one should conduct diplomacy in the modern world. One should try and avoid tensions, reduce tensions, not increase them. The Indians, in the end, are not going to thank the Americans for trying to keep them in conflict with their biggest and oldest neighbor.
Yeah.
They're going to be resentful of the Americans for doing that. By the way, again, I know lots of people from India. They are already. The Indians are clever enough to work out what the Americans are up to.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why there's rumor. It seems like a serious that the U.S. is thinking of sanction India, even though I
Yeah,
think sanction is getting less and less effective, but
yeah.
they will
Well,
not stop.
well, they will not. I mean, it's a crazy idea, and I mean, already apparently they've sanctioned a third of the countries in the
And
world. 60% of world trade apparently is now affected by sanctions in some form. There's even a report apparently in the US saying that this is becoming increasingly counterproductive, but they're just going to go on doing it because that's what they do.
yeah. Yeah. All right, the Middle East. Okay,
Mm.
there's so many things going on, right? I'm trying to. I wonder if
Uh,
you can
mm,
sort this through. So here are the things. Okay, Israel. There's rumor. I mean, there's a report saying Israel could preemptively strike Iran.
yeah,
We're still waiting for Iran's, I mean, revenge. But and then Lindsey Graham. Okay, Lindsey Graham being Lindsey Graham introduced a war power bill to strike
mm,
Iran's nuclear program. I mean, nuclear or not, the bill is basically saying to strike Iran.
yeah,
He introduced that bill, and their aircraft carrier is heading to the Middle East, if not already there. And several countries have been urging their citizens to leave Lebanon and other places in Middle East. At the same time, there's also a report saying the U.S. has sent delegations to Tehran to try to diffuse the tension.
yeah,
Now, it has not been confirmed by the State Department. I haven't seen it, but
yeah,
there's a report about that. And Shoigu now is also visiting in Tehran,
yeah.
supposedly brought with him some heavy weapons as well.
Mm.
So, can you sort through what is going on there right
This is exactly the classic situation that American diplomacy produces. So they are completely 100% committed to Israel. This has been the standard rhetoric that the United States has been engaged in for decades. They have an alliance with Israel. They have supported Israel in every outrage and crime that Israel has committed over the last 10 months in Gaza. In fact, the crimes in Gaza are getting worse and worse. This has resulted in an enormous um, global backlash against Israel, obviously, but also against the United States, because the United States is supporting all of these horrors. So the United States, which has become increasingly embarrassed, has tried over the last few weeks, very ineffectively, to try to persuade the Israelis to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza. And the Israelis do not want a ceasefire in Gaza, or to be more precise, the Israeli government does not want a ceasefire in Gaza. So, as they come under increasing pressure from the Americans to have a ceasefire in Gaza. They've acted to make that impossible by murdering Hamas's chief negotiator, which is what Haniyeh was, the man they've just killed in Tehran. He was Hamas's chief negotiator, negotiating with the Israelis through the good offices of the Americans to try and achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. So they murdered him. And they murdered him in Tehran, in the government guest house there, the equivalent of planting a bomb or launching a missile strike on Dayutai. Yeah, I mean, that kind of thing. And this, directly after Netanyahu goes to Congress, makes a speech in which he talks about Iran wants war with Iran, that, the United States and Israel should stand together and fight Iran. And if they do, well, they will win. He gets 58 standing ovations from Congress after he talks in that way. And as I said, that's why we are where we are. So there are some people in the United States, powerful people, many of them, who want a war with Iran. They wanted a war with Iran for as long as I can remember. They've been obsessed with Iran. There is a prime minister in Israel and a government which is led by religious extremists, because that's what some of them are. People like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, these people who want to reestablish the temple and all of that. They're losing the war in Gaza. They are under pressure from the Americans to agree a ceasefire. They would regard that as a major defeat. So they act with their friends in Washington to stop any possibility of ceasefire by killing the other side's chief negotiator. And they do it in such a way as to force the Iranians into a strong reaction, which they hope will then lead to that all-out war with Iran that they have been wanting all along. So that's the basic setup. Now, the Americans, of course, and when I say the Americans, bear in mind, there are many factions in the United States. The dominant faction within the administration and the Democratic Party are horrified by all of this. They do not want an expansion of the war in the Middle East. They understand how disastrous that would be for the overall position of the United States. After all, they've been trying to get a ceasefire negotiated in Gaza. So they're trying to stop an all-out war in the Middle East. But they can't criticize Israel because in the United States that is politically impossible, because for decades the US has been saying that they will stand with Israel no matter what. They can't take any action to restrain Israel, even though it's clear that it is Israel that is the aggressor and the main driver in these events. So what do? Instead, they ask Iran to show restraint. Iran has been showing restraint ever since October, but it is being asked to show even more restraint, even as the Netanyahu government shows no restraint at all. So the Americans are addressing their requests for restraint to the wrong party. The Iranians will say, well, look, we showed lots of restraint. And what has it got for us? The Israelis continue to attack us. Surely, if you want to talk your message of restraint, you should be addressing it to the Israelis and not to us. But that is not something that this very complicated political situation in the United States will ever allow.
And in the meantime, Netanyahu is not going to stop, right? I mean, they're talking about the preemptive strike now, which means before Iran does anything, they might strike again. And Netanyahu also said, because Hamas had got a new leader, and they said, you're the next. I mean, they're not going to stop, right?
No, which, of course, they're putting all that out, first of all, again, to make it crystal clear to the Iranians that, because they want the war with Iran. I mean,
Yeah.
this is the thing to understand. They want the war with Iran. So they're telling the Iranians, well, don't pay any attention to what the Americans are telling you. We're going to come after you anyway. I mean, we're going to go on coming after you. So, and of course, if there is any possibility that the Iranians do show restraint, well, we're going to launch a preemptive strike in order to attack them. It is absolutely clear. This is the important thing to understand. Which is the side that is destabilizing the situation in the Middle East, creating war and chaos there, killing people in the most outrageous way. Killing people is wrong anyway, but killing people in an absolutely outrageous way, carrying out a genocide in Gaza, doing extraordinary tortures in other places on the West Bank and wherever. And yet, it's not they who are being asked to show restraint. It's the other side to whom they're doing it. So if this absurdity continues, we will eventually end up in a war, because the side that wants the war is not being told to stop. I mean, it's as simple as that.
And it's also going back to the question we talked so many times about the sovereignty, right? Country seems like the hardest thing for any country is to have their own sovereignty, has an independent foreign policy.
Yeah.
Even the United States, it seems to me, like have a very difficult independence because they are controlled by the deep state, by the APAC, by big corporations like with their foreign policies. We just talked about China. Even people, moderate people, wants to have a good relationship with China, with Russia. Doesn't seem they can do it. It's not like there's no people in the United States have the right mind, but these are the people being sidelined. Nobody is listening to them. They don't have the real power. And with Israel, the same thing. I'm sure there are also people who, like Thomas Massie kind of people, do not think this is make much sense. But of course, nobody listened to him. So Israel just keep on going, doing all these things and continue to try, at least trying to pull the U.S. into the Middle East, which doesn't make any sense for the United States, right? But
Look, it doesn't make any sense with the United States. You're absolutely correct. There doesn't seem to be any way of shifting American foreign policy to a position of sanity and moderation. Whenever the attempt is made, all the forces that want things to continue as they are, taking the United States in the wrong direction, reassemble and stop any movement, to shift policy and to bring it back to a correct direction. And by the way, you're absolutely right about Israel as well. There are a lot of people in Israel who are very unhappy with the way things are going. Now, there was a very interesting article yesterday in the Financial Times in which apparently a whole group of military officers and security officials had a meeting last week with Netanyahu. And they said, look, this isn't working. We're not winning the war in Gaza. The army is exhausted. The people are unhappy. The economy is going badly wrong. We're becoming diplomatically isolated. We have got to stop. We've got to get a ceasefire. It's in our interests to get a ceasefire. We've got to get our people released. And Netanyahu apparently got furious and he called them weaklings. And he said, you're not under any circumstances going to put any kind of pressure on me. And he's able to do that because the Americans back him. Ultimately, he knows that the Americans back him. And of course, within Israel itself, there's all sorts of hardline figures who are in control of the principal levers of power. And they back that stance too. So despite the fact that there's lots of people who know that this is wrong, there doesn't seem to be any way of changing
it. Both the U.S. and Israel seems like the sound voice, the people who are saying doesn't seem to have control. So
No.